Thank you for coming. I'm going to talk about cyber warfare in the context of major military innovations. And this talk can have some alternative titles. One would be asymmetric warfare, or the evolution of conflict. And my favorite would be spy versus spy. And this is kind of a recurring theme during the talk. And we're going to look at some old stuff to figure out how the new stuff works. And this is me. I basically, from a professional side, I grew up in the Swedish defense industry. And I spent my time mostly building or cleaning systems that were made for different domains of war. And I started with in warfare, you divide up in different domains because war is different on land, and it's different in the sea, and it's different on top of the sea and below the sea, and it's different in the air. So basically you have land, air, sea, and then you have this thing called cyber. And cyber is kind of interesting because it connects everything, because everybody today uses information systems. And I spent some years in each of these, and eventually I ended up looking at development environments, because we build products that are aimed for war, and when we do that, they're built to a certain standard. But the actual systems that builds these products, they usually don't have the same standards. So if you were an adversary and you want to take down an airplane, would you attack the airplane or would you attack the factory that actually builds the airplane? And I kind of figured out that it was easier to take out the factory than the airplane. So now I'm devoting time to making the factories a bit more secure. And this is a very relevant quote. It basically says that you need to know what you're defending against, and you need to know how your attacker will do their attack in order for you to be effective in your defense. And these words of wisdom, they're not from a book. They're actually found on Twitter. And Twitter found it on Reddit. And this is kind of symptomatic for our life today. There's a lot of knowledge in books, and there's actually more knowledge on the internet. And it moves kind of fluidly depending on what people devote their time to. And we were talking about threat models. And it's kind of important to know that each system, each client, and each scenario usually has its own threat model. So you need to know that what you're working against is actually something that will happen to you. Or if it happens, it will be so catastrophic that it will only happen once, and then there will be no more. And then you have to act on that. So when we're talking about threats, the Swedish military has a good book. They have several good books, but one of them defines threats as there are two types. So you have the non-antagonistic threat, which is basically stuff that happens. And that's your natural phenomenons and your glitches in technical systems and the normal negligence and accidents. Now, these are not the threats that we're going to discuss today. We're going to focus on the actor-driven threat, which is basically intentional threats. And these threats usually occur because somebody wants to do something. And what they want to do is not the stuff that you want them to do. And since this is about the military, doctrine is a very good word to remember. And a military doctrine is basically, it defines how a certain country defends itself or wages war. So a very good example is if you take the Swedish Navy, the Swedish Navy's military doctrine is equivalent to the American Coast Guard. Because the American Coast Guard, they have small boats, and they're close to shore, and they also act on very short distances, weapon systems, radars, and all that sort of stuff. And they don't cross the Atlantic. Whereas the Swedish Navy, we're just in the Baltic Sea, and that's kind of equivalent to the distances of the Coast Guard in America. So if you would sell naval systems from a military perspective in Sweden to America, you would usually sell it to the Coast Guard. But in Sweden, it would be like the military. So that's kind of the differences between doctrines and countries and how they do business and how they do strategy, basically. Which brings us to this. So this timeline is not, how do you say that? It's not correct. You can see that the distances between 2000 BC and 1000 BC is kind of short in regards to the other distances. And that's because 4,000 years is a very long time. It doesn't fit in a slide. But what I'm trying to say here is that you have these 5 domains of war, and people, since we had empires, these empires, they want to expand and eat up other empires. So you've had war, basically, for a very long time. And infantry was first, because we had people. So we organized lots of people, and we put them in something we called an army, and then we attacked the city. And we've been doing that for 4,000 years. And during this time, though, in the land domain, you have all these military innovations that changes how you do war. So one of the major changes was that you could use animals, and then you got cavalry. And cavalry made it possible to transport lots of people faster with lots of supplies. And when you eventually invented catapults, they're very heavy. If you try to pull them like with normal people, that takes lots of people. With infantry and with cavalry and catapults, the way you built cities had to change. Because before this you had walls, and the walls protected you. Whereas with the catapults you could throw in dead animals, and then the walls would actually be your prison, and you would die of disease. Then somebody invented naval ships, and now you could actually attack cities from the sea. So before we had naval warships, you used the water as a security perimeter, because nobody would attack you from the water, because they couldn't move all the cavalry and infantry and catapults on the water. So you built your cities with the like near the shoreline and on cliffs, because then you have one less angle that you had to protect. But then we invented warships, and you could attack from the sea. So the people who own the seas, they own the world. And this was true until somebody invented airplanes, which is a very long time. I mean, I think that's 3,000 years, basically, from the start of war until we had airplanes. So the air domain, once again, changed all the other domains. So for each of these domains, when you had land, you only had land. Then you had naval. So naval changed how you do warfare on land. And then when you got air, it changed the other 2 domains. And this is relevant because up there, number 5, you have something called cyber. And it was defined in 1996. And that's not very old. I think it's 23 years. My next slide says it's 22, but that's because I made this slide last year. So the cyber domain is on top of all the other domains, and it's a 23-year-old. So a lot of the people in here are probably older than the cyber domain of war. And if you look at your life, you learn that you learn a lot when you grow older. So you don't do the same mistakes that you did when you were younger. And if you look at the concept of warfare, like on 1,000-year scale, or just 100 years, like we had airplanes in the early 1900s, that changed everything. So this baby here, which is 22 years old, is a very small baby in terms of warfare. And that means that the doctrine of cyber, how do we wage war in the cyber domain? What constitutes war in the cyber domain? How will this affect our societies? How will we plan for it? How do we develop things for this? That's very difficult because, as somebody said here on the Atlantic Council, the physics of cyberspace is very different. Actually, it's whole different from every other war domain. So basically, this means we don't really know how to do this. But there are some guys who've been working with data for a very long time, and that's the intelligence community. So the people who do espionage on a state level, they've been around for quite a while. What I want to say with this slide is basically that India and China, they had the first major civilizations, so they also had the first state-sponsored spying apparatus. As for Europe, we actually got our spying in the 1500s in England, and it was Walsingham. He was an advisor to Queen Elizabeth, and there's actually a pretty good movie called Queen Elizabeth, and you get a pretty good view of Walsingham in that movie. But he actually made it into the legal structures of the state, that you could have spying and sanctioned killings, and you could infiltrate the Spanish kingdom and do stuff so that would benefit the Queen Elizabeth. So this created the first intelligence service in Europe that was modern, you could say. 100 years later, the Russians followed, And then we had industrialization. So with industrialization, we moved from just moving with people, which is human, to all these technical stuff that is down there. And the thing you want to remember is that you went from human to a lot of ints, and you had SIGINT there in the middle. And SIGINT was basically signal intelligence. So you monitored the airwaves. Everything that was in the airwaves, you monitored and you got information. And this changed how you did war, because when you knew what the Japanese were doing in World War II, at the same time the Japanese knew what they were doing, you could position your forces. So America was able to listen in on the communication with the help of SIGINT. So this was a major factor in defining outcomes in the last major wars. But then we got peace. And we had the Cold War, and then that ended. So people were like, what should we do now? Oh, we have this thing called cyber. So who owns cyber? So the NSA, they actually coined the term SIGINT at rest. So it's still information, and we monitor information, but now it's resting in the cables instead of moving in the air. So we have SIGINT at rest, which means it's our domain. So the NSA basically grabbed cyber and made it into their doctrine of how they do war and how they help their state in winning the state's objectives. And since America is a pretty big factor in the world, like one of the biggest world powers, everybody else looked at them and said, okay, so that's what we should do as well. So all the intelligence services who did signal intelligence, they all went into cyber. And this was in '96. So this was before the rest of the world realized that this whole thing with data, it's pretty valuable. You can change stuff if you know stuff. So fast forward to 2017, when somebody realized that maybe data is the most valuable resource. Maybe it's not oil anymore. And for espionage, data has always been the most valuable resource. That's what they do. That's what you work with. So now you know how to use data, and you have the most valuable resource at your fingertip. Maybe you will want to use that. Which brings us to covert action. So in the old world, covert action was plausible deniability. You wanted to change things, and then you wanted to say, it wasn't me. I'm not really responsible for that head of state who just stepped down from this scandal, because we didn't do anything. So that's what you did in the old ways. But how do you do that in a world where everything is connected and everything is monitored, and most people have a smartphone with more computing capability than, well, the average computer 10 years prior to that? Well, you do improbable or implausible deniability, which is basically you do it, everybody sees that you do it, but then you deny it. And this sounds kind of weird, but if you look back at the Ukraine conflict, Russia basically went into Ukraine with tanks and little green men, and the world said, there's war in Europe. And Russia said, nope, there's no war in Europe. We don't have any troops in Ukraine. They're actually just they're on vacation. They brought their tanks with them because that's what you do. I mean, you bring your car on vacation, right? So no war. So nobody printed in the newspapers like war in Europe. It was just like, it's this minor conflict in a small country in the middle of Europe. I think we call it Ukraine. Might be some green people there. We don't know where they're from. So the newspapers that has these, I don't know the English word for it, but they're responsible from a legal perspective that the newspaper prints proper information, that they don't print lies. So if a newspaper print lies, you can sue them, and the guy who's responsible will get sued. So newspapers, they want to print stuff that's true. So if the head of state of a country says that, nope, I didn't do that, then there's basically no newspaper in the world that will print Russia is invading Ukraine. So the newspapers didn't print that. And all the blogs, they did. So all the blogs, they said, it's war in Ukraine. And normal people, they look at this and they go like, yeah, I actually think there is war in Ukraine because, I mean, those tanks are there and that's the military. So then the blogs, they're telling the truth, and the newspapers, they're actually not telling the truth. So you did this for half a year. And then it switches. Because then people know that we can trust the blogs, but the newspapers might not be trusted. But then you subvert the bloggers, and then you spread your information through the blogs, and then the newspapers will start saying that, oh no, the blogs are lying. But then everybody remembers, well, they actually saw the war and you didn't. And this is information warfare. And it's not part of cyber warfare in terms of definitions, but it's actually used very frequently. And we'll get back to that a bit later. So this is hybrid warfare in a nice picture. And what most of us are used to from our history books is just like regular military forces. And maybe you have some special forces that do some stuff. And there might be some irregular forces helping out, like the resistance or something. And then below the level, the line there, you have basically everything that's asymmetric warfare. And you have cyber attacks there. The thing is that cyber attacks can assist all the other bubbles, because everything that has an information system in it, it can be subverted, it can be hacked, it can be used for something else than it was intended for in the beginning. So basically, the problems with cyber is that it's everywhere, and it gives you a lot of power if you can control this domain and if you know a lot about it. And you can combine all these bubbles into something a lot more potent than just your regular standard warfare. And it's basically with the help of the information systems we carry with us every day, like smartphones, for example. So what does this mean from a national perspective? Well, everybody's heard about the war on terror, which was a high priority for America. So in an interview in 2016, James Clapper, who was the director of national intelligence, he said that 3 years prior to this interview, terrorism was knocked down by cyber as the top threat for the country. And that's because the war kind of already started. People are already using this domain for stuff that it wasn't really intended for. And it's because of geopolitics. So basically, nations are the empires that I was talking about earlier. So you always have empires, and they always want to protect their people, and they want to expand their business, and they want to get more money with less resources on somebody else's behalf. And that's kind of called geopolitics. So it's usually an overlooked influence in cyber ops. And this is the Baltic. And you have a lot of tension between NATO, EU, and Russia. And you see that little small strait that goes between Denmark and Sweden? That's the world's third largest oil chain supply. So there's like a lot of oil boats that go through there. And also you have this really nice fiber cable that transports a lot of information. So basically all information that goes from Russia to the world also goes through that little strait there. So you have the two most powerful resources, valuable resources of the world. You have oil and data, and it just passes through there. That might be interesting to control if you think of conflict and that some country will sanction another country. Which brings us into prepositioning. So if you have the old times of war and you wanted to invade a country, you would move your troops in, and everybody can see that. And hopefully there would be like war in Europe in the newspapers. But today, if you want to, and if you want to shut down that country, you would just shut down their television broadcasting system, and you would maybe shut down their electrical system. And to do that in the old world, you actually went in and you took over. Maybe you bombed some places. And it was very visible. But if you want to do this without using your people, like the people on the ground, you do this with a cyber operation. This means that you actually have to already have done it when you want to use it. Which means that during peacetime, you have to pre-position your exploits and your implants in these systems so that if there happens to be conflict, you can use them to your advantage. So basically what I'm saying is that during peacetime today, there's a high probability that a lot of countries and different threat actors are actually doing a lot of cyber aggression against other countries and other civil entities in order to, if there is a conflict in the future, they will be able to leverage that and use that. And this is very different from like 20 years back, because then if you would do this, you would infiltrate with human resources. You would have sleeper cells, like spy cells, And they can be found, and you can like throw them out of the country. And it would be obvious that these guys that you threw out from America recently, I think it was like 5 or 10 Russians that was a sleeper cell. That was like all over the news. Russia has sleeper agents in America, the Cold War is back, blah, blah, blah. But if somebody finds, oh, we have a cyber intrusion in our electrical system, who did it? We don't know. So it doesn't really make a big splash in the headlines. And you can also control the narrative. So this is a much nicer way to actually impose your will on another nation, which is why it's used. So another big geopolitical event is the China Belt and Road Initiative. And this is basically, China is building a lot of infrastructure, and they're pouring billions of dollars into making the world better from an infrastructure perspective. And this is in order to boost trade and also strengthen the political and cultural influence of China, because China is the second world power today. And some people say or believe that China wants to be the first world power, which would put America on the second place. And America has had the first place for a very long time, so they don't really want to be number 2, they want to be number 1. So this actually affects a very large portion of the world, because the China Belt Initiative, they build, so the green stuff here, that's basically where you can grow a lot of food, and there's lots of biodiversity and lots of water and nice stuff that people need to live. And the purple things are economical corridors, which helps trade. If you would control these very colorful areas, you basically control that entire part of the world, because trade is what makes the world go around. So this is a good initiative, you could say, but it also creates a lot of tension. And that's when it's nice if the governments in these countries will be willing to help you, and it's also nice if you can win the bidding. So, for example, if you look at the Colombo down there, like on Sri Lanka, China built a really nice harbor there, but Sri Lanka didn't have enough money to pay for it. So China loaned them the money, but then when they couldn't pay, they basically leased the harbor for 100 years. So first they loaned the money, and then they built the harbor, and then it turns out that the country couldn't pay, so then the country gave them the harbor. So now they have a harbor in Sri Lanka, which they own for 100 years. And this has happened before. It's called Hong Kong. But then it was the British who did it on the Chinese. And now they've learned, so they do it the opposite way. But in order to do this, you need to know a lot of things. You need to know, like, if we give someone this loan, will they be able to pay it? They think they will be able to pay it, but we know more because we have all this data, and we can do all these simulations. So we can know that in a couple of years forward, maybe 10 years, 20 years, this will probably happen. And when that does, we can swoop in and profit on that. So in order to do a lot of good strategy, you need lots of data, which is basically where cyber comes in. Which gives us another nice quote from the 70s. And this is very important to remember. You have lots of friendly nations, and they will help you, and you will trade with them. But there are no friendly intelligence services. So they will do what they're supposed to do, which is gather data and collect stuff. And that is not always known to the entire nation or to the people who govern the nation. And they're the ones that basically run the cyber operations. And this is what we usually call them, APTs. So, yep, I have 16 minutes. So APTs, these 3 bullets here, it kind of defines how an APT works. And this is also more or less the same definition for spying. You want to operate covertly, and you're very skillful at not being caught, and you want to collect a lot of information, and you're not really concerned if you're breaking the laws of the country that you're in. So it's basically espionage. But in the technical terms, we call them advanced persistent threat groups, which I think you could call an intelligence service also, because they're pretty advanced and they're usually a threat group. So in the old days, nobody really knew about threat intelligence and intelligence analytics. That was something that only intelligence community, they were the only ones who were doing this. But now in cyber, we have this whole field called threat intelligence. And it basically does a lot of the same stuff that you did in the old ways. You analyze your opponents and you try to define them and categorize them and find them so you can smoke them out. Kind of counterintelligence work. So there's this non-profit in America called MITRE, and you might know them from their CVE database. And in 2010, which is kind of the same year that Stuxnet was discovered, they started a research program which was designed to develop and learn of how to fight the emerging cyber threat. And one of the things that they came up with was the attack framework. And the attack framework is a wealth of knowledge, and you can use it for a lot of things. But one thing that is very easy to look at is their threat catalog. So they actually have 86 real-world live threat actors. And these are groups that are operating today, and they've done numerous attacks. Some are more successful than others. And they actually have attribution, which is quite rare that somebody will go out and say that we think this is China, Russia, or Iran. So out of these 86 groups, they have attributed roughly 50%. You can always look at the attribution and think about who is not in the catalog. And that will actually give you some information as well. So if you look at these attacks, and you try to scope them from a cyber war perspective, you can use these two bullets. Basically, it's geopolitical or financial relevance, or it's a very clear nation-state actor behind it. Which means that a lot of the attacks, like we have thousands of attacks every day all over the world in the cyber arena, but most of them, they don't qualify these criteria. And if we dial it down a bit more, and we look for 4 defining attacks, you get basically, well, I chose these 4. So you have the old school attacks, and then you have the 21st century attacks. And we're going to go over these a bit, hopefully within 12 minutes. So Stuxnet was patient 0. It was the first really cool malware. And it was built in the old school approach that you didn't want to be caught, and you didn't want to have any collateral damage, and you wanted to be stealth. And you had a very clear objective. We want to hinder or disrupt Iranian nuclear production. It was basically the first special forces of cyber. And it was a lot of things. It was a worm, a Trojan horse, rootkit, virus. And it was built to do 4 things. So if you study military doctrine, and especially the special forces, this is kind of what they do. You infiltrate behind enemy lines, you discover your target, and you destroy or disrupt your target, and then you evade detection and go back to your home country. And this was basically what Stuxnet was built to do. So once again, we're using our old ways of fighting, the old doctrine of war in the land domain, on our special forces, and we're applying that to this code. So it will behave in a way that we understand. And this was a very complicated endeavor. They spent a lot of time and a lot of resources, and they did a really good job. And it was 20 times more complex than anything that anybody knew at the time. So this was quite relevant when it was caught. Basically, it said that, well, now we actually have cyber war. And it was found, the first version was found in 2007. And then when they dug into that, they found that the command and control infrastructure had been live a couple of years prior to that. And then in 2010, it was like revealed to the world because it had spread all over the world. So eventually somebody noticed and they started digging into this. And then everybody presumed that Stuxnet was gone. So in 2012, they said like, oh, it's gone. But then you had the Iran USA talks where they were talking about lifting sanctions on Iran. And this is a very geopolitical thing because we've been sanctioning Iran for a very long time. And now they were lifting these sanctions. And there was a country that wasn't involved, they weren't invited into these talks because they don't like Iran very much, and that was Israel. But apparently somebody spied on those talks, and then eventually Israel called America and said that we think Iran is lying. And they said, how do you know that? You weren't invited on these talks. And they started digging in, and voila, they found a piece of Stuxnet. So it basically came back. So today most people they agree on that Stuxnet was a joint endeavor between America and Israel. But nobody has acknowledged this, so it's improbable deniability. It seems pretty obvious that it's them, but they say, nope, not us. So what can we learn from Stuxnet? Basically, offline is not secure. This has been like how do you say that? Panica, like the golden bullet in information security. If you put your system and it's offline, it's not connected to anything, then it's secure. Well, it's not, because you need to patch it, and maybe somebody will produce something in the system and they want to get it outside of the world, so then they have to export it and import it. And this is kind of how Stuxnet got into an Iranian nuclear facility guarded by special forces in a very strongly controlled country. And it caused real-world physical damage. It destroyed, I think, 100 or 130 centrifuge. And it was pretty interesting, because when they found Stuxnet, the people who found it, they couldn't understand it. So they actually had to pool resources. So they reached out in the research community and basically said, we found this very weird piece of code. Can you help us decode this? So everybody pooled resources and came together and they said, we think it's this. And monitoring. They had lots of monitoring in this nuclear facility, but Stuxnet actually recorded all the monitoring, and then it replayed it when it did its attack. Kind of like when you see on the movies when they break into a bank, they film the recording video stream, and then they put that on loop while they actually break in. So the people who are looking at the security feed, they say, oh, nothing's happening. There's no people there. But in reality, they're breaking into the vault. And this was what they did with Stuxnet. And the monitoring logs, they didn't have any integrity checks, because it's just logs, it's just monitoring. We don't have to have integrity checks on that. Well, now you do, because this is how you evade it. And this is like 10 years ago. So if you find systems today and they say we have lots of monitoring, you should ask them about their integrity of the monitoring. And then you have USB sticks. And they're really, really, really bad. It's basically an unprotected network. It's just very slow. And it's the weapon of choice. So how many look at their USB sticks and they go like, this is an awesome, omnipotent cyber weapon? Most people don't. They just go like, oh, it's only 32 gigabytes. That's not very good. I want it bigger. I want it faster. And that's usually what people say when they have weapons as well. They go like, oh, we want a bigger gun. We want it to fire more bullets. We want to blow stuff up, bigger explosion. So that's basically USBs. They're a weapon of choice in the cyber warfare industry. And it's been that way for more than a decade. But most people, they don't really realize it. So it's a great weapon. It's concealed carry in the civilian world. The next old school attack is the Kinetic attack. I'm going to speed this up because I don't have a lot of time. So this was basically, people think that this was China. So that's the attribution, but China says we didn't do this. Kinetic is an R&D firm like DARPA, but it's privatized. So they do a lot of really high-tech R&D for America and United Kingdom. And they were severely hacked for lots of years, 4 years, maybe more. And the people stole terabytes of classified data. And the only reason we know about this is because HB Gary was hacked. And HB Gary, they did security software that was used by Kinetic. And they said some bad stuff about Anonymous. So the group Anonymous got angry and they hacked HB Gary and they dumped all their email on the internet. And in the email dumps, you could read about the Kinetic attack, which wasn't very public before that. And basically, they stole everything in terms of robotic technology, AI, the F-35 airplane design. And if you go on YouTube around these years, you can actually see a lot of video from the Chinese military demonstration of how well they're actually doing in the R&D arena of modern warfare. And the drones and the airplanes and the stuff, it really resembles a lot of the stuff that America is also doing. But China did it better and cheaper. Might be because they had R&D on steroids, which is basically you use somebody else's R&D without paying for it. And Kinetic, they were notified a lot because they were very hacked. So their system hacked other systems that were connected. So the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, they called Kinetic and said, hey, your systems are attacking our systems. Can you take them down? And Kinetic goes like, no, I don't think we have any problems here. And then NASA call them and say, hey, your computer is attacking our computer. Can you take it down? Oh, maybe. So there was this report also in the HB Gary files. And the reason this could go on for 4 years was because nobody did the holistic approach. So you had like small contractors that came in and did the forensic investigations, and they worked like separate of each other. So nobody really put the picture together that they had like lots and lots and lots of attacks on a very long period of time. And maybe it was just the same threat actor that was owning up everything and stealing everything. So it took a while before they realized that this was actually pretty bad. And the funny thing is that they found that the Russians had been there as well. So it wasn't just China, it was Russia as well. So what can we learn from Kinetic? Basically, they stole everything in small packets. So once again, monitoring. They didn't have any two-factor authentication. This is a recurring theme. If you don't have multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication in your systems suck. And they will be thoroughly owned by anyone, basically. So please use multi-factor authentication. They didn't have any adequate detection and monitoring, and they had no separation whatsoever. So they actually hacked Kinetic from this car that was standing outside on the parking lot, and they had an unsecured Wi-Fi, so they could reach into the unsecured Wi-Fi, and then the Wi-Fi, it wasn't sectioned from the rest of the corporate network, and the corporate network was not sectioned geographically. So from this parking lot in a car, from the unsecured Wi-Fi, you can own the entire Kinetic corporate infrastructure, more or less. And that's where they developed military-grade weapons. So that's a pretty bad thing in terms of this factory that's producing stuff. The factory is not very secure. Oh, and if they had done threat intelligence, maybe just read the newspaper, 30 defense contractors were all targeted and attacked in 1 year. So if you look up in the newspaper around this year, there was like lots of headlines that people were getting owned. So if you work in an industry and you start reading that people are attacking your industry, maybe you should think that, they might be attacking us as well. Why haven't we noticed? Maybe we should check. And CloudHopper. So 2 minutes. This is an awesome attack. This is the new style. Kinetic was old style. They actually went to a corporation and they penetrated the corporation and they stole the stuff that the corporation was working on. In CloudHopper, they actually targeted the managed service providers that provided cloud infrastructure for lots of companies that were in the cloud. So basically, imagine you have a big city with lots of industry, and you have one cleaning service, you could say. Everybody uses the same cleaning service in this whole city. And the janitors and the cleaners, they have keys and alarm codes for all the companies. So you compromise that cleaning service and you have access to all the companies that they use. This is basically cloud. So if you have I'm going to jump forward. So if you have the managed service providers that provide all the cloud stuff for your infrastructure, they have all the credentials they need because they manage your cloud. So they have backdoor access. So what they did was basically they hacked all these the managed service providers in basically the whole world. They took the whole of Europe, the whole South America, and the whole North America, and just hacked everything. And they stole lots and lots of data, like enormous amounts of data. And they took everyone. This was not defense. This was everyone who was in the cloud. And then they used that for further attacks. because this is like bulk collection. And from that, you can pinpoint that these companies, they do really good R&D, so we want to focus on them, and this is defense, we'll focus on that, and this is politics. That could be interesting in our geopolitical context. And this was a massive campaign. They had like 70 variants, they had lots of backdoor families and Trojans. Now I have 9 seconds. So they did an upstream attack, which is why nobody found it. They moved it upstream, so the monitoring was like on the actual, like your company had monitoring on your stuff, but you didn't monitor the people who made your company spin around, so storage and all that stuff. So they basically just moved it upstream, and then they exfiltrated through the managed service providers, basically evading detection for a very long time. Don't outsource. Cloud is risky, but cloud is also where everything is, so you need to secure it properly. Use multi-factor authentication. This is extremely important. And be wary of the efficiency. It's very efficient to be in the cloud. It's good for economy, but it might not be good for your business if somebody steals your entire business and then spins it up somewhere else for less cost with all your R&D in the background. So be wary of the efficiency balance. And if you're Swedish, can read Swedish, I would recommend that you read the Swedish Signal Intelligence unprecedented report on this area. It's called the Åtgärdsförslag. And also, these slides will be available, and it has lots of references. So dig into the references. NotPetya is the modern attack. This is Stuxnet today, basically. NotPetya was it's extremely cool. It did public visible cross-domain effects. So this was a cyber attack, but it also hacked civilian companies in peacetime. It caused 10 billion of damages on civilian companies in peacetime who were not involved in the conflict of Ukraine and Russia. And it affected the supply chains all over the world, because Maersk here, the shipping industry, they supply food like all over the world, and it just stopped. So basically this attack attacked the world. And once again, there were no headlines in the papers, like cyber attack cripples the world, blame Russia, because Russia said, we didn't do this. And Russia says, meh, we didn't do this. And it's highly probable that they did this. And once again, it's the implausible deniability. So basically, they attacked numerous countries in peacetime, and they punished everybody who did work in Ukraine. And they also made the blame go to NSA, because they used this NSA exploit that the shadow brokers had stolen. This created a shift in focus, once again, information warfare. So instead of blaming Russia, people were blaming NSA for letting these cyber weapons be stolen and then used to attack Maersk. And this is brilliant. I mean, this is an epic win in terms of warfare and covert action. Your enemy gets the blame and all the focus go there. So they go on the defensive, trying to protect their mission, signal intelligence, and nobody focuses on the real perpetrator. And the perpetrator wins. And the civilian industry gets to pay. And civilian population gets to pay. So this is modern warfare, all wrapped into one beautiful attack. And there's actually a very recent article about this in Vice magazine. It came out like yesterday, and it does a deep dive in this. So read that. Beware of doing business in war zones. And remember that war zones today are not always defined as war zones, because once again, there was no war in Ukraine. Patch your systems, all your systems. The NotPetya, if it got in on one computer, so you needed one unpatched computer in your entire network, and then it used the pass the hash technique and just wiped the whole network. So you only had one computer that had to be unpatched, and then everything was smoked. And use separate email from your critical systems if you can, and do network segmentation, because they didn't really have that, so the whole network just poof. And have manual routines that work. Maersk, they restored their entire network for, there it is. So 10 days, people worked like round the clock, and they rebuilt their whole infrastructure. And the reason they could do this is because there was one server in Africa, a domain controller in Africa, and they had an electrical malfunction in the city. So that server was offline because of this electrical malfunction in Africa, which is why that domain controller was not wiped. So they actually went to Africa and shipped this physically into Europe and then into London, and then they could replicate their whole network from that one server. So it was just pure luck, basically, because in their threat scenario, the threat modeling said that it's highly improbable that our entire network will be wiped out in 2 seconds. It will never happen. So they had no contingency for this. Well, now you have a real-world attack which says it might happen. So you might have offline backup. That's good stuff. Yeah, so this is how you fight it, basically. It's not, you don't need magic. You just need to do good work. Proper engineering, proper technical controls, and relationships matter. I mean, if you have problems, it's really nice to know that you can reach out to other people and they will help you. So strong authentication, multi-factor authentication, it's very, very, very good. Do a lot of separation, physical, logical, lots of logging, awareness, visibility in your system. Know your network. Most people don't know their network. This is really awesome. Like you have this huge enterprise, and they do really cool stuff, and they have no clue how their network actually, how it is, like how it's designed. They have something on paper usually, and that does not depict reality. So know your network, and that's basically documentation versus implementation. Please help your government. They need help. So this whole cyber arena, it's very difficult. It's a small baby. It's like 22 years old. People don't really know how it works. So you need a lot of cross-domain experiences to work with this. You need technical people who actually understand the whole technical side of cyber and information security, but you also need lots of people who know law and legal structures and diplomacy and information warfare in terms of how do you communicate, what do you communicate, when do you do it, what's the message, and how do you respond, what constitutes an attack, how do you respond to that attack, how do you define that. If you're an old military guy, you just say like, yeah, we'll just nuke it. But you can't nuke it in cyber. So yeah, help your government, because governments run the world and we live in it. And then corporations usually live under a government. So be wary of that. Sorry for being over time. Questions?